So this is the 20th of November, 2023, Thanksgiving retreat, Applegate. And so there's probably all the people who signed up for this retreat, about 40 dropped out. So, and there's about 38 left. And that's good. It's a good group. I'd like to take this opportunity for those of you who may be new, to introduce ourselves on this first full day of the retreat. So this is Ajahn Krudadamo. He's been a monk for 26 years. I'm Ajahn Nyaniko. Ajahn means teacher, so Ajahn, we've been monks for longer than 10 years. Ajahn Nyaniko, 21 years as a monk. Then you have Ajahn Sudhiro, who's also going to be doing some teaching. He's been 11 years now. And then we have Samanera Hemako, he's a novice. And then Anagarika RJ. So us five have the opportunity to come here and be part of this year's Thanksgiving retreat. And it's good to, it's not always the case that we have to have big groups. Part of us might feel like, usually on the Thanksgiving retreats there's 55 or 60 people, or the last 3 years we were having them online and there'd be 80 to 100 people. And then it's good to reflect that when the Buddha taught, he didn't teach just because it was a big or a small group. Even if there was a single individual who was wanting to know about Dhamma, the Buddha would take time to just have a conversation, even with individuals. It wasn't like, well, I'm the Buddha. How can you think I'm not just going to teach 3 or 4 people? I have to teach thousands. I have to teach groups of hundreds or thousands. But that wasn't the case. It's always, whether it was 1, 2, 3, or 1,000 people, the Buddha could adapt to any of those situations. So, adaptability is a theme. And also Ajahn Amaro has just been at Abhayagiri for 10 days or so. And a really wonderful visit. He's now in the air on his way back to the UK, on his way back to Amaravati. So he just departed around just after 5 p.m. His plane took off. And Ajahn Amaro was talking quite a bit about adaptability when he was at Abhayagiri. Adaptability is the key to happiness. And it really is a very good theme, adaptability. In Thai we say "gan prap dua," which is just to be adaptable, to be able to change ourselves to any situation. And there's these different types of clinging that we need to let go of in order to stop suffering, according to the Buddha's teachings. Some of the coarser types of clinging are quite obvious, so letting go of things like sensuality, that might seem obvious to us, and that's one level of happiness. But then if we want to go further than that, then there's other things we need to let go of as well that might be perhaps more difficult to let go of. Things like views and opinions, biases. Those are much, much more difficult to let go of. So the clinging to sensuality, this is kam upadana, but then clinging to views, that's dit upadana. So much more difficult to let go of. And it's really worth thinking about that if we can't let go of views and opinions, if we can't let go of our biases, we can't stop suffering. So that kind of flies in the face of the normal views of the world, how we tend to feel, and I'm this way as well, and how we tend to feel is, well, if people agreed with me, then I wouldn't suffer. If everyone just had the same political view as me, I wouldn't suffer. Or if everyone could see that this really was the case, then I wouldn't suffer. But that's actually a type of clinging that very holding to those views is why we suffer. It's not that. So what we're doing is we're kind of seeing things back to front, and we suffer. So the Buddha is kind of amazing in pointing these things out. Not only do we have to let go of sensuality, but we also have to let go of our views and opinions. And there's also some other things we have to let go of, but we don't want to focus on too much at one time. So just focusing on those is enough, especially for a 1-week retreat. And one of the first steps to this is actually putting space around things. Or even just questioning things. Is that so? Is that really the case? Or even sometimes when we ask questions, there's an assumed truth in the question, the way we ask questions. So looking at the way we ask questions, what types of assumptions are we making within the questions? So at the beginning of a retreat, if we're thinking about wanting to not suffer, or wanting to have a sense of happiness and well-being, or wanting to be able to let go, first what we're going to focus on is how to uplift the mind. Because normally we want to let go when we're really suffering a lot. If we're suffering just a little bit, we might feel like, well, things are good enough, things are okay enough. Maybe we don't need to let go. But if we're really suffering, then we might think, I really want to let go. But if we're experiencing some happiness and well-being, we might think, well, maybe I don't need to let go. Things are good enough. And yet, what we need to do when we come to the practice is we need to uplift the mind and then let go from that place of upliftment. Normally we want to let go of the wheel of samsara when we're at the bottom, but there's no letting go when we're at the bottom, and we have to actually let go when we're at the top. So we uplift the mind, we gladden the mind, we do our daily meditation and do our Dhamma reflections, and then when the mind is in a state of well-being and the mind is uplifted, then from that there's more of a chance that we'll be able to let go. So we want to let go when we're at the bottom, but when we're at the bottom and we're crushed by suffering, then there's no letting go there. But when we're at the top and we're doing well, there might be the tendency to get complacent or to get intoxicated with our sense of well-being, with our happiness. But instead of that, we can actually cultivate mindfulness and contemplate impermanence. And from the top, then we can let go. And then I think it'll be better than what we expect. So then there's a little bit of a paradox as well here, because when we let go, then we experience some happiness and well-being. It might be more happiness and well-being, more peace than we've ever experienced before. But then it's automatic that we're going to cling to it. because we want to keep that. We don't want that to change. We don't want that to go away. And then right away, that clinging then weakens it and makes it less. And then years might go by, and I think, how could I get back to that? So it could almost be considered cruel how the Buddha might hook us to start practicing. We meditate early on, we might have a really good experience in the meditation. It's a genuine experience of letting go. And then the mind clings to it and we can't get back to it. We want to recreate it. And yet that very experience came through not trying to create something. So we try to recreate that happiness we experienced right at the beginning, that happiness that brought us to the practice, that really hooked us in the meditation practice, but then we can't get back to it, and it's incredibly frustrating. Because we're trying to recreate it, so the only way to really get back to it is to try to not recreate it. So eventually we practice for years. If we have some ability, it might not be years, but for most of us, for myself, years, and then eventually give up again. Oh, right, there it is. Okay. And then automatically, again, the mind clings to it, but then we see, okay, well, now we know to be careful of that. So perhaps next time we could say, well, okay, so so that's genuine happiness, but if I cling to it, it disappears. But it's almost automatic to cling to it because we want to be happy, we want to keep that happiness. But if I cling to it, if I try to grab hold of it and keep it, then it slips through my fingertips. So that's the art of practice that we need to develop, is how can we practice just to practice? It's almost like we have to not care about getting any type of experience, any type of happiness. We just practice. We just have to forget about really getting any sort of amazing experience or gaining any sort of great happiness through the practice. We just practice. And so in that, then we can start to build up that sense of deep contentment, deep happiness that doesn't slip away because we start to learn to not cling to it. So that's the way of non-suffering that we want to learn about. I remember Ajahn Jayasaro. I remember asking him one time in Thailand about how can you know you're making progress in the practice. So like speaking for myself, okay, when I meditate, I don't have these extraordinary samadhi experiences. And I quite appreciated his response, which was, well, it's not really about having these amazing experiences. One way to gauge your practice is if the mental defilements, the corruptions of mind are becoming less, if the sense of self is becoming less, if attraction and aversion are becoming less in the mind, or a sense of intoxication is becoming less. So if we get less angry than we used to, if we get triggered less easily than we used to, then we're doing something right, then the practice is working. On the flip side of that, if we're able to get these really deep samadhi experiences and really amazing bliss states, but we come out of that and then the slightest thing sets us off, the slightest thing triggers us, the slightest word or phrase sets us off and we become enraged, then it's not helping us. So really what to look at is the baseline level of samadhi, which we have all the time, would be the firm establishing of the mind becoming more stable and firmly established. And that's more the panya, that's the wisdom aspect. So it's far more important, because that's what's really going to lead us to the way of non-suffering. And there's just so many pitfalls, so many drawbacks. The mind is a real trickster. So then we might think, well, if I was to really practice and go for non-suffering and really go for nibbana, really put everything on the line and really stop suffering quickly, well, but there's still this and that I want to experience. What if I was to become an arahant, then I couldn't there's all these other things. I have this bucket list I want to experience, all these things I want to do, and I won't be able to do those things if I just finish the practice quickly. So there's another pitfall, because that's a trick of the mind. We need to become convinced that arahantship is the best way to live. It's not that we have to do this or that beforehand. Living by Dhamma is the best way to live. Living the way of non-suffering is the best way to live. It doesn't matter what we do after that. It won't matter what we do after that. We won't get. I mean, it won't matter. In the suttas, it says that if we don't consider nibbana as the highest happiness, we can't attain it. So it's really important to consider these things. So just asking ourselves, it's not about really hearing the right teaching to get the mind uplifted, but we have to actually figure it out ourselves. So every person's going to have different kamma and different tendencies, and everybody's going to have to figure out their own skillful means. How can the mind become uplifted? Yeah. So it's not about just getting a jolt of sensual happiness, which is very fleeting. That's not how we uplift the mind, because it's going to drop even lower if we're dependent on those things. But how can we uplift the mind in a way that has non-clinging as a factor and also as a very deep happiness? It's not about just getting jolts of excitement, not just about seeking different experiences, because that mind of seeking is discontentment. That mind of seeking is, the mind is discontent, so it's seeking something. So looking at the mind that's not seeking, why does the mind have to seek something somewhere else? What's going on there? What's driving that process? What's keeping us? What's stopping us from being discontent here and now? Is it pain in the body? Is it that we're tired? Is it that we're cold? Is it that we're hungry? How can we hold the mind in a way that our sense of happiness and well-being is independent of all those things? So coming back to that idea of adaptability, how does that link with having a deep sense of happiness and well-being? How does that link with being able to uplift the mind? One technique is also being able to just say, well, it's okay. I feel a little bit tired. It's kind of feeling sleepy during the meditation. Well, it's okay. Not a problem. That's just natural, especially at the beginning of a retreat. Say, I have that difficult memory coming up in the space of the meditation, or the mind is just messy. The mind is not in an ideal state. So one of the difficulties of starting a meditation retreat is that when we put more space around the mind and we start to see things more clearly, well, the mind is messy. It's not the way we would ideally like it to be, with beautiful mental states all the time. And that's okay. If the mind has thoughts that are less than ideal, then we don't need to act on them. And the mind is not self. These are just causes and conditions for the mental states we're experiencing were put in place a long time ago. This is kamma, or karma in Sanskrit. Karma is a central tenet of the Buddha's teaching. It's linked with the whole idea of the round of rebirth, samsara. And sometimes we might have a mental block against taking on those ideas of karma and rebirth. We might think, I'll just take everything else about the Buddha's teaching, but I won't take that. I'll take the teachings about, maybe I'll take, actually I don't know what you would take without karma and rebirth, because it's all linked together. You pick up one part of the Buddha's teaching, it's like a sheet, everything else comes up with it. So if we're not able to take karma and rebirth as a working hypothesis, at least, then we don't get any of the Buddha's teaching, actually. That's actually how it is. I'll come back to Ajahn Jayasaro again. It's talking about how a lot of us tend to have an irrational disbelief in karma and rebirth. It's like we refuse to believe it. Like, okay, it must all be metaphorical in the suttas. It can't possibly be the case. But there's no real strong basis for disbelieving it. It's more that it's just somehow it might fly in the face of the worldview we were brought up with, or I don't know. It's a irrational disbelief in karma and rebirth. So at least being able to take it on as a working hypothesis, because the Four Noble Truths implies that, dependent origination implies it, every single thing about the Buddha's teaching implies it. And karma is a description of the process of suffering, and because of that, it is possible to end suffering as well. If it wasn't karma and rebirth, there would be no end to suffering. So I think Ajahn Amaro, during his visit, he was talking about when he was a junior monk, he did a sutta study one time and was counting how many suttas contained these ideas of past and future lives, karma and rebirth, or not even karma, but just rebirth. How many suttas in the canon had that? He said it was about 1/4 of them mention it. So that's a lot. So it's right there. It's a big part of the teaching. So there's one sutta that, this is a common question even now. It was a question that would be posed to the Buddha. Well, you talk about not self. Well, what's reborn then? You talk about rebirth. Isn't that you're contradicting yourself? Isn't that a contradiction? You talk about not self, but then you talk about seeing all your past lives on the night of your enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and at the same time you're talking about not self. So how is that? What's reborn then? Is it form that's reborn, or is it the khandhas that's reborn? What's reborn? So the process that drives this, the Buddha goes on to say, well, it is something that's difficult to see and subtle, difficult to understand. But it's kind of like you have two candles, and at the time of death, at the breakup of the body, after death, your body is like a candle, and consciousness is like the flame on the candle. And the process of rebirth or transmigration is like the candle touching another candle, and the flame transferring to another candle, to a new body. And can you say that that second flame is the same flame as the first flame? Can you say that that second flame is the same flame as the first flame? And the answer is, well, no, you can't. And yet it does resemble the first flame. So that's how the Buddha he describes it in one sutta. And there's a fuel that keeps the flame going, and that's upadana, that's clinging. And then there's tanha, which is the cause of upadana. Tanha is like the wick, or like so that's normally translated as craving. And that's the tanha that's described in the Four Noble Truths as the cause of suffering. And the complete ending of craving is the complete ending of suffering. And the complete ending of craving is craving is what's reborn. And the complete ending of craving is the complete ending of rebirth. So that ties the whole process of rebirth and transmigration to the process of suffering, so this whole mass of suffering. So it's all tied together. So we can take it as a working hypothesis. We don't absolutely have to believe it, but to look into it, to consider it. And we might hear these ideas as well, and our mind might suffer over them. And so looking into that as well, what's that causing that? There's another sutta where the Buddha talks about giving attention to perceptions of resistance. So when we hear a teaching that might challenge us or challenge our views, our deeply held beliefs and assumptions about the world and ourselves, then what's that perception of resistance that's arising? So giving attention to perceptions of resistance is also one factor of being able to let go and to lighten the mind. Once we develop a sense of lightness and a sense of peace and well-being, the mind is going to be in a very positive and wholesome state. So during a 1-week retreat, we don't have so much time, but probably a lot of you are already noticing that during a retreat, when we're meditating through the day and practicing, the day can seem longer than normal. And so much can be done. Even during a 1-week retreat, even during this short period of time, to make the mind a bit more wholesome. When the mind is wholesome, that is happiness here and now. And when the mind is unwholesome, that is suffering here and now. That's one way to start to know, to start to gauge the wholesome and unwholesome. When the mind becomes unwholesome, whether it's to a lesser or a greater degree, there's heaviness, there's tightness, darkness. when the mind is wholesome, it's light, spacious, fresh, bright. So one way to learn about how to experience when the mind, how to gauge when the mind is unwholesome or when the mind is wholesome, we can just think of, say, when we get irritated or frustrated. Say we're watching the news and we think, oh, that happened again. Or we see something really, really negative, really awful, war or killing or things that it's really virtuous to disagree with those things. And yet, that trickster comes along and it tricks us into having unwholesome mental states based on it. So we get frustrated, we get irritated, we get angry, upset, enraged. That's unwholesome. It's suffering here and now. And the wholesome mind is actually quite difficult to cultivate because it's not yet habitual. So part of us might think, well, if we respond to the idea of war or killing with just positive mental states, there's something wrong with that. And yet, that's the best and most efficacious response we can have. Absolute love, absolute just positivity. That's the best response possible because that's what we want to put into the world. We don't want to put into the world more frustration, more anger, more irritation. We don't want to be adding that to the mix, even though it kind of has a righteous or a virtuous basis. All we're doing is adding more anger to the mix. So it's that we have to be careful of that trickster that's telling us to do that. So when the mind is wholesome, that's well-being, that's lightness, here and now. And from that, we're able to start to build on that. And this wholesome and the unwholesome, for myself, it's taken me a very long time to really get a sense, get that compass going, to really know what's wholesome and unwholesome. So over 21 years as a monk, I've developed a feeling for it. Okay, I can be pretty sure when my mind is unwholesome, and I can be pretty sure when my mind is actually wholesome. And it's taken a long time to really develop that compass. That's one way, that's one hint is, okay, well, the unwholesome, to a greater or lesser degree, it's suffering here and now. The wholesome, to a greater or lesser degree, it's happiness and contentment here and now. So that's perhaps a rough or a coarse way to look at it, but it's a good beginning. There has to be these contemplations and these techniques as well to try to get the mind to be more wholesome. Saying it's okay, being adaptable, being able to let go of our views and opinions. This is going to really help the mind to become more wholesome. Clinging tightly, clinging tenaciously, having those mental conversations where we're arguing with our friend who we disagreed with, that's going to be leading to the unwholesome. That's, to a greater or lesser degree, suffering here and now. So just considering some of those things, and sometimes because we give these talks, and it's not that you have to really remember it, but just to pick up on one or two words which might help you through the retreat. just refreshed, wholesome, skillful, bright, light. Just being able to drop that in there anytime. And when we give these talks, they might be kind of broad brush, but just taking, even if there was one sentence that might help you to create more of a wholesome mindset and help you to let go a little bit more, that's what's important. It's not about remembering everything that was said. When Ajahn Mun would give Dhamma talks, he was sometimes known to preface his talk by saying, when I talk, you should be meditating. If your mind becomes peaceful and you don't hear what I say, it doesn't matter, because what I'm talking about is to make your mind peaceful. So if your mind becomes peaceful when I'm talking, it doesn't matter if you hear what I say or not. But if your mind isn't yet peaceful, then yes, listen to what I say. But if your mind is already peaceful, I don't even care if you're listening or not, because that's my whole reason for talking. So he was known to preface his talks like that. So that's the whole intention, that's the whole point. So that's probably enough for this evening to end the first full day of this retreat, and truly wish everybody well and hope you all develop in wholesome mental states and learn how to let go a little bit more and have a little bit less clinging and a little bit more wisdom as time goes on. So I'll leave it there for this evening.